least 12 feet away from everybody. And I'm splattering against my computer. And this is supposed to be online services anyway, right?
Yeah.
Can I get rid of the feedback?
No.
You're on the...
Yeah, that's okay. Well, he's got plenty of social distancing.
That's right, all the social distancing. In this heat, nobody wants to stand this close to a radiator anyway. Amen. Thanks for joining the English Sunday School class today. This is July 25th of 2021. I found out that on some of the Facebook Watch application, if you watch it on a TV instead of from a phone or a computer, it doesn't put a date. And they kind of just all scramble together based off of how many times they've been seen or liked or things like that. So these aren't necessarily, the sermons aren't necessarily in order on the Facebook Watch on the TV app. So in order to get around that, if I start talking about today is July 25th, hey, everybody knows what the date is. So we're still in looking around. We're spending a lot of time looking around here with this biblical creationism study. Last week we discussed how the variety in color, shape, pattern, and scent that we observe in flowers is a direct result of the intimate association of the flowers with their animal partner pollinators. Another word for this symbiotic mutualistic relationship is cohort. We saw evidence from God's design in unique and harmonious relationships which could not have arisen randomly. Amen? We focused mostly on plant and insect cohorts last week. Today we'll look at those with birds and mammals. Not necessarily in that order. So, speaking about animal cohorts, as that relates to the symbiotic relationship with plants, there is quite a variety. Excluding insects, like we started to look at last week, bats and birds are the main animal pollinators. There are a few plants that have partnerships with mice, possums, primates, even snails or earthworms. Animal pollinated plants produce nectar, which is a sugar-based substance containing vitamins, amino acids, and other nutrients, which the animals then use as sources of food for themselves and their offspring. The amount of nectar that a flower typically produces relates to the physical needs of its pollinators, almost as if it was designed that way. But first, we're going to start with mammals and bats. The diet of bats varies from species to species, but you can group bats by about three main feeding preferences. Some of them are opportunistic, which means they'll feed on whatever is available. Some of them are primarily feeders on night-flying insects, and others, thought I knocked the TV over. Others eat fruit or the nectar from plants. So those are the three main categories. Bats rely on sight and smell, even though we have the joke about being blind as a bat. Bats rely on sight and smell to locate their food sources, and since they feed in the evening hours, night-blooming flowers are a main nectar source. Many of the nectar-eating bats have long, thin tongues, like hummingbirds, that can reach deep into a flower for the nectar. Nectar-feeding bats also have short ears and slender noses that make it easier for them to get into a flower. And then they have big eyes for excellent vision. So if you see a bat that has big eyes as opposed to little bitty eyes, they're likely not carnivorous or scary vampire bats or anything like that. In contrast to the fluttering, zigzagging flights of insect-catching bats, the flight of a nectar bat is strong and direct, and they can hover while they drink the nectar from a plant without really disturbing the flower too much. Pollen grains cling to the bat's fur, and that's another indicator of a pollinating bat is a lot of the hair. That means they're going to be eating around flowers and fruits and stuff like that. The hair is mostly for the pollination. And then they're carried to the next plant, ensuring the fertilization of their food source. Bananas, mangoes, your favorite, dates, figs, peaches, cashews, guava, avocados, and agave rely on bats for pollination transfer. Nectar drinking bats in the tropics are indispensable to maintaining the forest diversity and regeneration. There are many plant species which grow in tropical regions. However, most of them are low in number and scattered throughout the forest, which presents a dilemma for pollination and how they would need to transfer pollen effectively between plants of the same type for fertilization. Sometimes they're more than 100 meters apart from each other. The answer to that, obviously, is flying insects, bats, and birds. And research has shown that bats can transfer nearly 4 times as much pollen as hummingbirds can at any given period of time. So let's look at a couple of examples of bat pollinators. The first one is the tube-lipped nectar bat from the forests of the Andes of Ecuador. It's a smaller guy, has a little bit of hair, but if you notice from the photos, he can launch his tongue 1.5 times his body length. That's longer than any other mammal, and it's second only to chameleons for vertebrates and how long of a tongue extension they can execute. And it's twice as far as the next member of its scientific family. So it stands alone in this particular physical trait. God's genetic design for bats as a kind has allowed this bat to adapt a longer tongue to feed on a specific tubular flower that you can't really tell in the photo, but the nectar is all the way down here. Because the tongue length is about equal to the length of the tube for the flower, there is a striking relationship here. Just like humans, the tongue of most bats originates at the base of the throat. So the only way to get a long stretching tongue would be to stretch the snout out, right, along with it. But this bat, if you see here, his tongue is based, the tongue retractor is back here in its rib cage, and it's attached behind the sternum, between the sternum and the heart. So the tongue has a lot more length. But the base of the tongue, which is what ultimately limits the length of the tongue, is a lot farther back into the chest of the bat. And it's the only bat with that physical trait. But this gives the tube-lipped nectar bat, it's hard to say, it gives this bat sole pollination rights to this flower. Right? So that relationship is completely codependent. They eat nectar from this flower, and only this bat can pollinate this flower. To ensure that a bat's head will be dusted with pollen, a flower must be wide enough to accommodate the snout and the face. The Joffrey's tailless bat, or Joffroy's tailless bat, if you want to pronounce it that way, has a long tongue, an elongated muzzle, and their face allows them to get, because of this elongated muzzle and their tongue, allows them to get into wide-tubed flowers, specifically. Again, tailless bat, another oddity of God's creation, diversity. Then there are only 3 nectar-eating species of long-tongued bats found in the United States. But the pollination of agave and various cacti in the United States would drop approximately 97% without those 3 bats. And the greater long-nosed bat, there's greater and lesser, long and short, lots of different varieties, lots of variety. The greater long-nosed bat synchronizes their migration from Mexico to arrive in Texas exactly to coincide with the summer blooming cycle of agave plants that they depend upon for pollen and nectar, and the plants depend upon them. But they don't live in Texas where these plants are. They live in Mexico. They fly in their migration pattern to Texas where they need that food, and that plant needs them, and then they fly back to Mexico again. Fascinating. But this is how important some of these partnerships, these cohorts are to the survival of both plants and animals, almost like God has it figured out. Another fascinating cohort involves the flying fox. This is the gray-headed flying fox with a baby. And so I mean by the bigger eyes, they're not typically carnivorous kind of bat. But these bats can weigh up to 2 pounds and can have a wingspan that exceeds 3 feet, or almost a meter. They consume fruit and nectar and are important pollinators and seed dispersers of native trees. That's kind of cute. That's not cute. Right?
Yeah, we've seen those in the Philippines.
Yep. This species is native to Australia, mostly, but obviously they can be spread out from there. They fly up to 25 miles to forage for flowering gum trees, eucalyptus, paperbarks, and banksias. And it's estimated that a single flying fox can dispense up to 60,000 seeds in one night. This is a very important mechanism for rainforest region revegetation. That's the word there. Not all bats are scary and bloodthirsty, as some people believe, but they do serve interesting and important roles in God's natural world. There are other mammal pollinators. We'll just go through a couple of them real quickly. Over 50 species of land mammals actively visit and pollinate flowers. This includes several species of possums, arboreal mammals, which means in the trees, such as marsupials, small primates, and some rodents. Flowers pollinated by primates tend to be unscented and very large to accommodate the heavier body weight of their pollinators. Flowers pollinated by marsupials usually grow higher in the tree canopy, and flowers pollinated by rodents tend to be located at ground level. Makes sense. Don't know why that would be confusing to anybody, but here are just a few examples of fascinating relationships from various regions. This is the red-bellied lemur in Madagascar, which has a distinct relationship with several different plants. The sugar glider, which is a small gliding marsupial, kind of like the flying squirrel is in America. In Australia, that has these eucalyptus plants and sugar cane and different stuff, specific pollinator relationships there. But my favorite, in the temperate forest of Patagonia in South America, the seeds of mistletoe, which we spoke about in a couple lessons previous, are dispersed solely, only, by another marsupial known as Monito del Monte. That's the name of it, Monito del Monte. And Monito del Monte, this little bitty marsupial, he's not a mouse, he has a pouch, right? Or she has a pouch, I don't know, it's a he or she. But this little crazy looking thing, some scientists believe that they might be related to Australian marsupials. However, as it stands right now, this is the only species and genus of creature in its family, like in its scientific family. It stands alone. By current classification, it is not actually related to anything else. It's just itself. But the important point is that this created kind of animal has a unique role in its environment. There are nearly 100 families of birds and mammals in Patagonia that rely on mistletoe for fruit, nectar, and nesting material. Only but the seeds of mistletoe do not survive intact when they're passed through other animals, like coffee beans do, or coffee bean fruit. Only Monito passes these seeds undamaged in its digestive tract and deposits them directly on the bark of host trees for the mistletoe to grow. So there's an amazing lesson that this tiny little guy, or gal, is a mostly unknown creature. Had anybody ever, even online, had anybody ever heard the word Monito del Monte before this? No, absolutely not. Nobody's ever heard of this, unless you're a scientist that studies this stuff. So, widely unknown little creature with a thankless relationship with mistletoe, but it's the key to the biodiversity of all of the Patagonian forest. And that's just such an amazing example of God's ability to use anybody for his glory. But this little creature can also show us that the conditions of being a mother are pretty universal. I thought that picture was pretty funny. Alright, so, Monito del Monte, don't forget it. Bird pollinators, hummingbirds, obviously the most common, most well-known pollinating bird is the hummingbird, and there are countless varieties of hummingbirds. They play an important role in the pollination of numerous species of shrubs and vines, some of which are specifically adapted to hummingbird pollination. We'll get to that in a minute. Throughout the Americas, that's all of North and South America, it's estimated that there are 8,000 plant species that have flowers whose principal pollinator is a hummingbird. Generally, the plant and the hummingbird relationships are facultative, meaning they're not fully dependent on each other for their survival. The plant has a beneficial relationship with the pollinator, but because there are many species of hummingbirds and many varieties of flowers to pollinate, a unique and dependent partnership isn't necessarily present. Of course, there are always exceptions to the rule. Let's talk about two. The rufous hummingbird has been called the most important hummingbird pollinator in western North America because they migrate from Alaska to Mexico and pollinate flowers along their entire journey. That little bitty dude flies from Alaska to Mexico and pollinates flowers all the way down the western coast of North America, and then turns around and goes back again. That's amazing. That's amazing. And then in Peru, there's a rare species of bird called the sword-billed hummingbird. It looks fake. It looks like a cartoon to me. But the sword-billed hummingbird has a 4-inch beak, which is just long enough to pollinate the long-tubed Testconia plant. Much like the tulip nectar bat, this little fella here has sole pollinator rights with that plant because no other bird has a long enough beak to pollinate or to drink from that plant. So fascinating little varieties. Flower structure design may facilitate pollination by a primary pollinator, right? In this case, a primary pollinator, and then restrict other ineffective pollinators. Flowers can manifest variation in their corolla length or width, or their flower color, the odor or lack thereof. An example of this is red coloration in hummingbird pollinated flowers. The red coloration may develop primarily to discourage visitation by bees and preserve pollen for hummingbird, because scientists have learned that bees require more time to find red flowers than they do of any other color, especially blue ones. And bees will stay at a patch of blue flowers instead of expending the energy to look for a patch of red flowers. And I wonder if maybe this is why bird feeders for hummingbirds, why am I going to click each one, are red. Go back. Okay, now it's going on its own. Lots of red varieties. That didn't work. It was supposed to teeter a little bit. It's a red solo cup turned into a bird feeder. That's the way we do it in the country. Okay, not important. Hey, there it goes. Bees use scent to locate flowers, and they can carry more pollen than hummingbirds can. And they tend to deposit most of those grains in the first few flowers they visit after they left one flower. Hummingbirds, instead of scent, use sight to locate flowers, to deposit pollen grains more evenly across a group of flowers. And because of their higher metabolic rate, obviously, they ingest more nectar than bees. So hummingbird pollinated plants have little or no fragrance because the birds use sight, and produce greater amounts of nectar than bee-pollinated plants. It's almost as if they were designed that way. Speaking of design, hummingbirds are designed to drink nectar from tubular-shaped blossoms. Okay. Bill designs, you can see the different bills on these hummingbirds, influences the type of flower that's utilized by each species of hummingbird. There are long bills that fit into long floral tubes like this. There are short bills for short tubes, and these different partnerships allow long-billed and short-billed pollinators to coexist with minimal competition. They don't have to fight for the same flowers because of the variety of flowers and the variety of hummingbirds. Their bills can be straight, like the sword-billed hummingbird, or they can be curved, like this guy in Europe. Generally, that corresponds to the floral tubes that they frequent. Another unique design is the hummingbird tongue. It's like a pump with grooves on the side of it that opens up and then closes to be able to collect nectar. It's fascinating. Oh, and if you didn't see this, that's a tongue. It's not just a curved beak. His beak ends here, it's open, and the tongue is sticking out. So, boom. To consume enough nectar to survive, hummingbirds must visit hundreds of flowers a day. We're there already. And they're excellent flyers. In terms of maneuverability, they can fly up to 60 miles per hour. We can't even drive that fast. Most of these roads here in Korea without a camera catching you. With their long blade-like wings, unlike other birds, their wing connects in a ball and socket. You can't really see it there. Or there. That's horrible. I have to darken that up before I ever present it again. But they have a ball and socket shoulder joint compared to here. It's a ball and socket joint that goes down to the elbow, up to the wrist, and then extends out. Whereas with a pelican, their sternum to their shoulder is right there, and it's a lot longer. That ball and socket joint allows 180-degree movement of their shoulder, which gives them a lot more control, and it enables them to fly forward, vertically, backward, which is the only bird that can do that, laterally or left or right, and they can also fly upside down. And the ability to fly backward is possible because of the muscles on the back of the hummingbird are just as well developed as the breast muscles are. So every other species of bird only has power in the downstroke to stay aloft. They don't have any power in the upstroke, but hummingbirds have an equal amount of power in both directions, so they can fly backward, they can fly upside down, and they have a lot more maneuverability than any other species of bird. It's fascinating. And because their wings are larger in proportion to their body weight than most birds, they're of a similar size, they can also hover, which you've seen. Most video that you see or looking out the window at a hummingbird, with the fact that they can beat their wings up to 200 times a second. Most of the time, you just see a floating body. You don't even see the wings, right? It's just, oh, they're still, nope, they're still, oh, they're still. They're just bouncing around out there in the air, doing the things that hummingbirds do. But they can, with that speed, they can sample up to 20 flowers a minute. And it's just an incredibly unique design. Love the hummingbirds. There's some other bird pollinators that we could look at. I encourage you to look at them on your own. Just Google search them. You can find them all over the place. They include the Hawaiian honey creeper, sunbirds, sugarbirds, and the brush-tongued parrot. I think there's also a lorikeet or something like that. There's some other versions of bird that have a brush tongue, but it's this weird-looking tongue that comes out and it has bristles on the end of it that when they stick their tongue out all the way, it kind of opens up, and it's almost like if you were trying to pick up soap bubbles with a toothbrush, right? Like it just gathers them all inside there and holds onto them, and that's just a fascinating design. That's not a very common thing. But from all of these examples and so many more that we could have talked about, we can see how God designed different flowering plant species to ensure or to develop a variety of strategies to achieve pollination with their flowers and ensure a new generation of plants. And some of these plants rely on the wind to move pollen, like a dandelion does, but most of them depend on the symbiotic contact of an insect, a bird, or an animal. In some cases, this link between the plant species and its pollinator has become so close that each is dependent on the other for its continued existence. And the reason for having this evidence, the reason for looking at this relative to the biblical worldview is that this reminds us of another key relationship that is that is key to our existence and continued survival. And that's the relationship between man and his creator God. And we have a God who has chosen to reveal himself to us. And he's done that by giving us the entire creation. Everything from the small particles, the quarks, all the way to the galaxy and the universe around us. The host of heaven, as it were. And all of it has a part to play in God's general revelation of himself to his creation, to us specifically as man, the ones with the ability to discern. Because you don't see giraffes and sunbirds out there talking about how the ant reminds them of God's desire for industry and initiative. And you just don't, there's no evidence of that. It seems like we're the ones that can learn. We're the ones that are responsible for learning. And God wants us to know him. So that matchless grace requires a response. And that's why we're doing this, to find more and more reminders of just how much God loves us. Amen. Any questions today? It's a lot of flowers.
Korea's got the smallest hummingbird.
Oh yeah?
They're about the size of a bumblebee.
Wow. That's cool. I didn't know they had those here in Korea.
Yep.
Yeah, I had one of those pictures that I put up of, like, there was like 9 different hummingbirds on the screen. The one on the bottom left looked real furry. Is actually the smallest one. Super small hummingbirds.
Yeah, it's not much bigger than this part of my thumb. In fact, the first few times I saw one, I thought it was a big bumblebee.
Yeah.
And then it got a little closer and you could see its beak.
That's crazy. And how could anybody look at something like that and not just absolutely say, what a marvel.
Yeah.
God has created such marvelous things. I can't look at that and think, wow, chance circumstances over millions of years miniaturized that, or some aliens came down and shrunk it with a freeze ray or something. Like, come on, there's no other way than that. Is irreducibly complex, and it is unfathomably hard to consider any way that could have come about on its own. Just that whole microscopic connection of tissues and all the things that it does. And the fact that you could just swat it, right? And it's done. I mean, wouldn't evolution find a better way? That I couldn't just swat that thing and it'd be dead? Or why is it so delicate? Because life is fragile. But yeah, lots of lessons. But I'm going to have to look into that, some of those little bitty guys. Amen. I got through that a lot faster than I thought I would. I guess let's pray and we'll get ready for the service.